I begin. Okay, I've begun. Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to introduce Carola Dunn, not quite right.
That'll do.
Close. This is the first author that we've had at the Marcola Elementary School Media Center. And Carola was born in England, but she's lived on the West Coast for many, many years. And
50 or so.
Maybe more than you'd like to confess
Well,
to.
more than I'd like to confess.
And you've been a resident of Eugene for like 30 years or something.
26.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to writing very dear to some of our hearts, Daisy Dalrymple Series, she's also written the Cornish Mystery Series and many, many Georgian romances. Regency romances. Wrong period, sorry. And
is it time for me to?
It's time. And questions during your presentation.
Oh, questions anytime. I
Yes,
love questions. Okay. And this is going to be kind of a mixture of book stuff and travelogue because, as some of you know, my Daisy books are set all over the place in England, mostly in England. One is actually set in America. So I thought I'd just show you a few of the places where they're set.
Oh, cool.
Okay, question.
I don't know why I'm touched.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Do you go back to England to see the different
I
places
do.
when you write the book?
I do. There's one or two imaginary places.
So this is running. You might, if you think about it, just kind of
Well,
wiggle
I
the mouse
started
every
to
once in a while
just
so it doesn't go to sleep. We're not sure if it'll stop the
Partly
podcast.
because it's
But
set in the small
Anthony
town.
White just sent me a
about
message and said it's
2
streaming
miles
right
from
now.
where
The
I
audio
grew
sounds
up.
fine.
Oh,
For
in
now.
the village where I grew
Just
up.
wiggle it, and then when it's
you
done,
see the
she's just gonna
houses
close it.
back there.
So,
That
Not a problem.
is so right, unlike many of my covers. Oops. See, this is the actual town. And I sent this picture to the artist, and he did a very good job on that. Of course, there weren't cars all over the place. Let's see. Yeah, I'm skipping one, I think. Oh yeah, this is that's the town, part of the town. This is the inn where Daisy stayed while she was there. I can't point out her window because the thingy won't work. Actually, as far as I remember, I put her at the back where it was quiet because she was sick when she was there. And this is the war memorial at the church just across the road from the inn. And that plays an important part. So the superfluous women were the many women in Britain who had no hope of finding a husband or having a family because so many men were killed in the First World War. And a lot of them were middle-class women because they were the subalterns, the junior officers who went over the top, leading their men. They were just shot down in large. I mean, comparative numbers, it was the grunts, it was the foot soldiers, the privates, in numbers who were killed more, but proportionate to the number of each,
middle class
there were a far higher proportion of the other men. Though in this book, I do deal with one young woman who is not middle class, not upper class. She's a maid at the hotel, and what happened to her family in the war is part of it. And I called her Hedger. You see the name Hedger up there? There are two Hedgers. I called her Hedger. I looked through the telephone book. I'll be telling just oddments that will give you an idea of the sort of research I do, basically. So when I thought, well, I might as well use a name that's actually on the war memorial, I went and looked at phone books to see if there were still any Hedgers there, and I couldn't find any, so I thought, no one's going to get upset about this. I didn't bring a photo of there are 4 sides. This is a small village in those times. It was probably less than 1,000, but on one side there are 6 people from one family, 6 people with the same last name, which shows you the sort of devastation there was. And this is another one. I started with 2 that are very heavily based on the war and the effects of the war. I'm not sure why, but Anthem for Doomed Youth is, again, about one of the after effects of the war. It's about the father of a young soldier, underage soldier, who was shot as a deserter, and how he revenges himself on those he holds responsible. This is the English cover. This is the English cover. What you can't see, at least I can't see, is there's a row of soldiers. Maybe you can see them.
You can see a faint outline, yeah.
Like charging, running up.
Well, it looks to me as if they're escaping, as if they're
Running away.
not running away, but you know, they've been through battle and they're all sort of, they look really tired. But this I like better than the American cover. I have this wonderful artist now who does my American covers. The Superfluous Women was one of them. They found him when I got to, I think, the 11th book or something. Before that, the covers were very variable. That's another facet of writing. You never know what they're going to put on the front of your books. And sometimes they ask my advice, and sometimes they say, this is the cover. You're never sure what you're going to get.
Why are there 2 different covers for United States and Britain?
At that time, let me see. It was a long time before they were picked up by the English publisher. The earlier books had, as I said, very variable American covers, and the English publishers decided to go with their own covers. You can see there are some of theirs here. This is one of the English covers, chiefly because I ran out of the American edition. But you see, they went with an almost cartoonish, which is similar in a way to the, what the paperback publisher, which are another lot of covers, did. But after a time, they realized that the American covers were really good now, so they started using the American covers. So this is the English edition with the same picture.
They remind me of the fashion plates of the time.
Yes,
kind of Art Deco style.
Yeah, I had to make him change a few hats and hemlines in the first couple of books. And once he got them, he got them. This is, I'm sorry it's so tiny, but that's the school I went to. And that is where Anthem for Doomed Youth, half of it is set. It's how many of you actually know Daisy? How many of you are familiar with Daisy? Okay, half of you. Daisy is a young woman of the 1920s. Her brother and her father, well, her brother died in the war. Her father died in the flu pandemic at the end of the war. And he was a lord. Because his heir was killed, a distant cousin has become lord, because women not being able to inherit. And Daisy decides that rather than going and living on this distant cousin, or on her mother, who is a really difficult person, she will try to make her own living. So she goes off to London, and she ends up with a job as a journalist, magazine writer. So that's the sort of background of all this. In the first book, she meets a Scotland Yard detective. And by the 6th book, no, so before that, I think, by the 4th or 5th book, I was getting letters saying, you really can't keep them apart much longer when they're going to get married. And then I'd get letters saying, "You're not going to let them get married, are you? It'll ruin everything." So they were engaged for several books, and then they got married. It doesn't seem to have ruined anything. But anyway, in this book, they're taking two different paths, because Alec, the Scotland Yard detective, is dealing with a triple murder. The bodies found buried in Epping Forest near London. And Daisy is dealing with a murder that happens, I'll show you where, that happens in the town where my school is, in this garden, which is a public garden in the town, and specifically in the maze. She goes to her stepdaughter's, Alec's daughter's, sports day. And she takes the kids, she takes her stepdaughter and her friends into the gardens, and of course they disappear in the maze, and out come frightful screams when one of them falls over the body.
Are those yew trees, do you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they are. And of course we got stuck in the maze without finding the centre, and we managed to get out, and we found a gardener who took us to the centre. I said, "I really need to see the centre." And this is one of the delightful surprises in the centre. It was a sort of a sculpture. Well, it was a climbing thing. So you could get up and see your way out, supposedly. And one of the struts of it had this snail on it, and I just fell in love with it. And this is typical of the town and the area. It's plasterwork, and all the old houses have this beautiful plasterwork just for fun, really. And I thought I'd throw in an example of that. And Gone West, this takes place in Derbyshire, and it's my writing is writing book. It's about a writer of westerns, and a friend of Daisy's is his secretary. Of course, when Daisy goes to visit, there's a murder. This is one of the difficulties of writing a long series. You always have to have a reason for Daisy to be there, you know. And you know people wouldn't invite her anymore after a while. So she tries to keep it very quiet. But her friend who's working for this writer, this is how I managed it, thinks there's something wrong, something very wrong. She's very uneasy. This is a very isolated farmhouse up in the hills here. And she invites Daisy because she, you know, the network of school friends, the news gets out. And so the friend knows that Daisy's been involved in this stuff and hopes she'll be able to settle her doubts. Now, this is another one where the picture is interesting. You see the hills, nice steep hills in the picture. Mm-hmm. When they showed it to me before it was finalized, and there were nice gentle hills, and I said, they're not like that. And I made them change that.
And is this the same artist as Superfluous?
Yes, this is the one who did all the later ones. That's Dovedale in Derbyshire. And this is something in the nearest town. It's called Smedley's Hydropathic Establishment in Hot Springs, or Mineral Springs. And in late Victorian and early 20th century times, people used to go on holiday to these places. And I just have to show you what they put themselves through. I don't know if you can read that. A Vichy douche. One of the bathrooms, apparently with bars on the door. The plombiere bath. the high frequency bath. I don't know why they weren't all electrocuted.
Yeah.
Right?
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet ray bath, the radiant heat bath, and the diathermy and high power parabolic reflector. You'd think they'd be fried if not electrocuted.
Sunburned and
Anyway,
I worked these into the
That's what I
book.
was going to ask.
No, yes, I could not. I thought I must try, but it just didn't work with the story, unfortunately, because the story was planned before I found this marvelous handbook online.
Did the snail in the middle of the labyrinth end up in a book?
Yeah, I did put it in, yeah. Mhm. This is another setting. This is my second book, The Winter Garden Mystery. It's set in Cheshire. I was at university in Manchester, which is just north of Cheshire, and this is a house I visited a couple of times while I was there. I'm sorry it's again so tiny, but it's just the most fantastic old Tudor building, and you can go through it now. But I thought, what a fantastic setting for a mystery. I often start with a place. As you know, that is, I want to write about a place, and that leads to an idea of what could happen in that
I think
place.
that's one of the things that makes it so charming, you know, it's so different for us who,
The places,
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, plus the time on. you
Plus
know,
the time, yeah.
It just makes it, that's what part of the fascination
Yeah.
is.
this bloody tower, the Tower of London. Have any of you got to that?
I'll have to, but
There is the tower from the, and if I had my laser pointer, I could show you. This is Traitor's Gate, where people were taken to have their heads cut off, basically. And I was looking for a picture of, no, I won't go into that, the place where, this is some steps leading up to the Tower Green, which is where people were executed, actually there. And I thought this was a perfect place for a murder.
Oh, my.
Shove in the back and he's gone. So I had a great time researching that. I was in touch with the Royal Armouries library was there at the time, and was just before it moved. And I got in touch with the librarian, and when I went over to do my direct research, I'd been as a child, but not for many years. She had, not only did she have a pass waiting for me, which saved me a lot of money, but she had collected a box of books she thought would be useful or might be useful. And one of them was the Governor's Day book. For the week, I put Daisy there. So I knew exactly what had happened every day. Of course, I had an imaginary governor, so you can't put real people in unless you're really careful. I mean, you can mention them, but, you know, using them as a character, and I wanted to use the governor at the time. That is a village near where Daisy grew up in Worcestershire, which floods regularly. This is the River Severn.
Number 6, that's where I'm at right now.
Number 6, that's,
In
yeah,
the
you
water?
said, yeah. Well, that's not here, that's in Henley on
It looks
Thames.
like that when I
Yeah,
imagined it.
it's- That was a lousy cover.
Ah.
And really, well, the hardcover was one of the absolute worst, even after I changed it. It's set in Henley on Thames, which is about 35 miles outside London. And when the cover, they showed it to me before it was finalized. When the cover arrived, it had a silhouette of London, had the river and a boat rowing, and the silhouette of London, Tower of London. They managed to fit in, you know, everything. St. Paul's, the Tower, Big Ben, Houses of Parliament, the whole lot.
All of it wrong.
All of it wrong. And so I rapidly wrote to my editor and said, why have they got London in the background? You can't do this. You can't do this.
Yeah.
And so he asked the art department, and they said apparently to show it's set in England.
Well,
Well, this was my 6th book or 7th book,
All in the.
all set in England, none of which had the Tower of London on the cover. So I got them to change it, but it's still a really, really bad cover. They did it instead of putting a background of Henley, which has a really attractive Georgian red brick silhouette, or the old bridge. They put in a sort of generic grandstand. Pathetic. No, this is in Worcestershire. And the only reason to put that in is that Daisy ends up with a dead body in the car she's traveling in. And or she's not sure if he's dead. And she wants to get him to a doctor, and this is the nearest doctor, and all the roads are flooded, so they can't get there.
Are those the boats that people live on? But
They used to be, some of them still, but more often they're rented out for holidays.
okay.
The narrow boats, yeah. And this is just a serendipitous discovery when I was there in Worcestershire. A friend and I went to look at this stately home. And since it was a stately home, it had been, I can't remember what it was first, and then it was a boys' school. And then it was taken over by some sect of Buddhists. And they went through the whole house, turning all the plasterwork into this. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. I think it's a really beautiful job. I was so pleased to find that. But it's no good for the story because it was about 30 years ago, 20 years ago. This is my next book. This is Daisy 23, which will be out in July.
I love the cover.
Yeah, isn't it fabulous? With the nannies.
Mm-hmm.
A dead nanny. That is the Crystal Palace. It was built for the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1852 or 3. And after I think this is after they moved it. They moved it to a park in South London, took it down bit by bit and moved it, and added 2 more wings.
Wow.
And then it had a fire in 1936 that completely destroyed it.
oh, no.
Nothing left now but the foundation. You can go and look at the foundation. This is the park as it was in 1928, when
So that's
27.
the palace in the background?
Yeah.
Yes. This was 1928, an aerial photograph. Daisy was there. Yeah, Daisy was there in 1928. So it's been sort of curtailed at this end. They had a minor fire that only destroyed a small part of it, but that's how it looked. And this is the other thing you can see still in the park. That is a monster.
I was going to say a troll.
It is a monster. Oops, let's give that a bit.
Oh, a real monster.
Yes. I can't remember the date, but it's something I mentioned in Rattle His Bones also, I think, the book that's set at the Natural History Museum. In Victorian times, there was a sculptor who decided to make gigantic sculptures of the creatures. They were just beginning to do paleontology and dig up all the bones and try to put them together. And in fact, I said in Rattle His Bones, the gigantic Diplodocus, whatever it is, Apatosaurus, I think they call it now, in the main hall of the Natural History Museum, they actually put its head on the end of its tail, something like that, something really extraordinary. They weren't sure how anything went together, and so they more or less invented it. And he did these according to the latest ideas of the time, and they are big. There's a picture you can probably find online of him hosting a dinner party inside one that hasn't been finished yet. They are enormous, and they come into the story because Daisy's nanny, her children's nanny, is found unconscious in the water with her head against one of these creatures, this specific one, the one with the snaky neck. And the children, she has twins, I'll give that away. That's another thing. When she got pregnant, which was in, I can't remember which book, but I got all this advice. No, she has to have a daughter because Belinda, Daisy's stepdaughter, ought to have a sister. No, she ought to have a boy because she's already got a girl. So I got so many people saying one thing or the other that I said, okay, she's going to have both. So she has twins, and when we get to this one, they're about 3. But they don't discover the...
Do the Daisy books advance chronologically?
They advance chronologically, but they start in 1923, and 23 books later, we've only got as far as 1928. I had this idea in my head when I proposed the series to a publisher that I would be able to stop inventing titles. So I'd written a lot of Regencies, and I was running out of imagination for titles, and I hated trying to think up titles. And so I thought, okay, no more titles. I'm doing Death in January, Death in February, Death in March, and each murder will be associated with the month. So the first one is Death at Wentwater Court, where there's a body in the frozen lake. Good start. Winter Garden Mystery, body in the garden that starts blooming early. But my publisher had the publisher who picked them up had just done an anthology, different people writing stories on that theme. So they wouldn't buy that title. So I had to start thinking up titles again. So that's why Death at Wentwater Court is such an appalling title that no one can remember because I had to think it up in a hurry. But Daisy's in Heirs of the Body, some distant cousins from Jamaica turn up. And there are 2 boys who are around Belinda's age, and they come to London for a visit. And this is one of the things they want to do. They've heard of these monsters. They want to go. No, Belinda, that's it. Belinda really wants to see the Crystal Palace. And then they get to the palace and start reading the guidebook. And the smallest boy wants to see the monster. We're going to see the monster now. Do we have to wait till the afternoon? I need to go and see the monster. So how did that jump?
You hit something.
Did I hit something? See what happens if I hit something else. No.
I'll try.
Oh, okay. I think we're practically at the end. No, we've got the Cornish yet to do. What's the time doing?
Okay, slideshow.
I didn't hit it. Maybe it was this thing.
Finally started to work.
Yeah, finally. Oh, I'm sorry. I've blown it. Perhaps if we click on one of the pictures.
Click on one of the pictures.
Just click on one of them. I'll get that brief. Yeah, there we go.
I now you can go
Backwards.
backwards. Perfect.
Oh, but this is giving it all away.
That's okay. We won't remember.
Oh, there you go. So the kids see their nanny behaving rather strangely. And she's following another nanny. There are a lot of nannies in this book, into the park. So they're sneaking along behind to see where she's going and what she's up to. And so they are the ones who find her in the water, unconscious.
Well, at least they didn't find a dead body.
No, they didn't. Daisy found the dead body in the ladies' loo. Okay, now I'm moving on to the Cornish Mysteries. This is part of the view. This is the rest. My godmother had a caravan for many, many years in a field, a farmer's field, up on the hillside above Crackington Haven. And we had a chemical loo. There were these two big water tanks in the field. And so around the corner from the water tanks, we had a chemical loo. And you could sit there and look out at this view. That's Penkenna. And that one's Cambeek. But this shows you the kind of scenery I was writing about. We used to go every summer, sometimes at Easter too. And it's just the most marvelous place, and I had to write about it. This, I don't know, do any of you recognize this? Anyone watch Doc Martin?
I was going to say, it looks like
It's Doc Martin. This is Port Isaac, which is where Doc Martin is set. Of course, they call it something else, which I can't remember, but my village, which is very similar, which I invented, is called Port Nabin. And it's set on the coast between Port Isaac and Boscastle, which is another little port. And this is what the harbour looks like. That was the inner harbour you saw in the previous photo. And then it's got these stone quays jutting out into the harbour with all these rocky hillsides.
Is the water freezing cold like the Pacific?
Well, we used to go in at Easter, but we were probably crazy.
Yeah.
It stays pretty cold in summer.
Don't you get a bit of the Gulf Stream?
Oh yeah, it's not as cold as the Oregon coast water.
Oh, how pretty.
This is in the name escapes me. Padstow. It's in Padstow, and this is typical of the lanes in the small towns and villages. They're barely wide enough for 3 people, let alone cars, but cars go down it. This inn is where I put some of my characters in this book. It's called Colourful Death. And right opposite is the gallery where the murder takes place. My heroine, I was telling you, Daisy's still in her 20s, right? After all these books, and I wanted to catch up with myself. And so Eleanor is considerably older. She's in her 60s. And she's a widow. She spent her life traveling all over the world as emissary for a big charity, which I call LONSTAR, London Committee to Save the Starving, something like Oxfam. And her husband was killed in a riot somewhere in the world, and she retires to Cornwall, and she buys a little cottage in a row, and she turns the ground floor into a LONSTAR charity shop, and she lives above it. So that's the setting. Padstow is down the coast from Port Isaac and Port Nabin. There's a wide estuary, not very big, but you have to cross on a boat to get there or go miles around. And Eleanor's next door neighbor is an artist, and so he gets involved, and she gets involved because of him, because the guy who is murdered in the gallery had just really done him down. So, and then this is the scene of Valley of the Shadow, which is the third book. You can see the footpath here winds all the way round up to the road, which is about a mile, I should think. And in this inlet, Eleanor and Nick, the artist's neighbor, and her niece, who's a local police officer, police detective, see something bobbing in the water and find a guy floating there, almost dead. And Megan jumps in to get him, being a trained rescue, whatever. And the water must have been higher. The tide was higher at that point. I don't think she would have, well, she probably would have jumped in, but they would have had a lot more trouble getting her out if the water had been that low. This is what it was like, but it was a calm day when she jumped in. So I tell myself. This is one of our favorite places to walk, and those flat rocks were perfect for picnics.
Mm. So did you ever jump in that water?
No, I wouldn't advise it. I would not advise it. This is the sort of coastline. It ends up with Megan going on a lifeboat to rescue some people in a cave. All these little coves have caves in them where the waves have found the softer rock and dug into the cliff. So you can see it's pretty hairy. And it's a big bay. It's Port Isaac Bay, actually. I was standing on this, looking down when I took that. Good. Boing. This is one of the local inhabitants giving you the evil eye. I've never seen such a nasty looking herring gull. And this is the setting, well, it's the end of that book, in fact, of, what did I say it's called? But when you've written this many books, it's really hard to remember. Valley of the Shadow. And this is Falmouth, which is on the opposite coast. And it's quite a big port. But when I went to research and I saw that house, I thought that is exactly where this story ends. It's up a bit of a slope, there's steps coming down to the water, there's lots of sailboats, and they end up, Eleanor and a young girl in one boat, sailboat, and Nick and Megan in another sailboat, trying to escape from a crazy man in another sailboat, and going up the river. That is where I intended to set the next book, Buried in the Country. So I went down there and I had a wonderful day exploring. That's Mount St. Michael, St. Michael's Mount. I had a wonderful day exploring, but it just didn't work for my story. I didn't mind having wasted the time because it was absolutely fascinating. But I did a lot of research on the family that lived there, the Lord, whatever. This is where I eventually set it, not in this building, but this is in Tintagel, which you've probably heard of if you know anything about King Arthur. This is the old post office.
Interesting line.
Very old post office. It's not used as a post office anymore.
Oh, the slate roofing tiles? Or?
Slate roofing and stone walls, yeah. Most of the buildings in North Cornwall anyway are slate, which is why it's not on these covers, but the American covers have houses with tile roofs, brick houses with tile roofs. This lot they got completely wrong. In the second printing of the first one, they got a reasonably good picture of Port Isaac-like town, but the cover, I didn't bring the American one because I'm so fed up with it. The cover of this book, Buried in the Country, showed a Dorset village. When I posted it on Facebook, several people recognized it. That's Gold Hill in Dorset. Looked nothing like a Cornish village. So this is where I actually set it, that monstrosity up on the hill, which is a Victorian hotel, which would never be allowed now. But they got it in before there were land use regulations and before the National Trust took over all the coast. This is taken from King Arthur's Castle, so-called, which I think they've now decided actually was a Roman camp, which was considered a rumour at one time. But the latest research shows that there was at least some sort of encampment there. And you can see here part of what is known as the castle. So it was probably monastery buildings. But it's quite hairy climbing up there. This cove, I think I got a picture of the cove, you know. The cove is not a harbour. It's much too dangerous to be a harbour, but you can walk down and then you walk up these incredible staircases on the side of the cliff to get to the castle. And I have to say that none of the story is actually set in the castle, but it's talked about. That's the village up there, the village of Tintagel. I don't know what this is going to look like on that. Probably nothing.
It's just kind of a glare.
Yeah. This is the English cover, which is excellent because the story ends on Bodmin Moor. This sort of country, really rough country, and Eleanor and a lot of police end up there looking for two murderers and their hostages, one of whom is Nick, the artist neighbour. That's a quarry. Eleanor goes up there. And late in the evening, getting dark, it's foggy, and they're staggering around in this area. Eleanor is involved in the search because she pushes her way in on the grounds that she really knows this area. It's actually a very pleasant walk if you stay out of this sort of stuff. There's a circle of prehistoric stones called the Hurlers. Supposedly there's people who went out dancing, doing their circle dances or whatever on a Sunday, and they were changed into stone as punishment. That's up at the top of the quarry, and in fact Eleanor finds one of the people right beside that in the dark. This is the sort of hazard you meet when fighting your way across the moor. It's gorse. I don't know. Yeah, I think so. And they're trying desperately to get rid of it, but it's native in England. Gorgeous yellow flowers in the spring. This is another hazard. Some of the searchers stumble in the dark on a group of ponies who are trying to sleep and aren't too pleased at being woken up. This is one of the Hurlers. These are some of the Hurlers around there.
Are they wild ponies? Are they wild ponies?
Yes, they're Bodmin Moor ponies. This is another hazard. It's really boggy in some places, and there are pools, and the horses, of course, go to drink and leave a mess like this, and someone actually dies, and one of these, face down in the mud.
Yeah.
And that's just a sort of farewell. That's actually in Worcester. But it's, you don't see, I think this is the only one, that shape, I have ever seen. And I don't know what king it is because it doesn't have the, you know, most of them say GVR or something like that.
Is it a mailbox or something?
It's a mailbox, yeah. It's a letterbox. So that's a farewell pick. Back to superfluous women. So you've seen most of England at this point, except the parts I did before I got a digital camera, because I haven't scanned them. They're all in albums. So,
having published all these books, is it one publisher?
all the mysteries are the same publisher. Yeah, that's one way in which I've been incredibly lucky, because a lot of series die when an editor leaves, and the new editor isn't interested, or you know, they have different ideas of what they want.
Do they hound you for new books?
Well, yeah, they do. I've had the same editor throughout for both series, not for the Regencies, but for those. And yeah, he wants a couple more, which I'm not sure if I'm ready to retire. The Regencies, I had, I think, 5 publishers. The first one was bought by Warner Books. Yeah, Times Warner, you know, all that, which keeps changing. I mean, they keep changing not only who they're associated with, but what they do. But in those days, it was Warner Books. And so I quickly, being stunned at having sold it, I quickly wrote another one. And by the time I sent that in, they were no longer publishing Regencies. So I got my editor there recommended me to an agent. So I got an agent, and she sold to the next one to Walker Books, which was a hardcover publisher. And it's nice to have a hardcover publisher because you get your books in libraries and so on. And then Warner started publishing Regencies again, and they started picking up the Walker books and publishing them in paperback. So then I went on writing for Walker for a while, and they stopped the line again. Warner stopped the line again, but Walker kept it going for quite a long time. And then, let's get this sequence right. I got divorced and I had to start making a living. And at that moment, Harlequin, which had a Regency line but had stopped publishing Regencies, it's the hazard in the Regency business, started a new Regency line. And I met their senior editor at a conference, and she knew my name, and she said, "Oh, our new Regency editor is a fan of yours." So I was writing for Walker and Harlequin when I moved up here. And within about 6 months of each other, they both stopped publishing Regencies. Now, at that point, I was in the middle of a 3-book contract with Walker, and they published the first one. The second one I finished and sent in, and they gave me the rest of my advance, but they said they weren't going to publish it. And that was the second of a trilogy. And the third one, my editor there had wanted a book with a baby in. Romances were coming out with babies in all over the place, and she wanted a Regency with a baby. So there's my heroine, 8 months pregnant, and they say, "We don't want it, we're not buying it." She remained 8 months pregnant for about 2 years before I found another publisher. Finished the book, got it published. Go ahead.
Does your most current series, will it be offered in the Kindle format?
Oh, it is.
Oh, it is?
They all come out as Kindle as soon as they do, yeah. Yeah, there's only one that isn't in Kindle yet, and that's the one that hasn't come out in paper yet.
Did you bring any of those that we could buy tonight?
You can buy any of these.
Oh, did you have
Yeah.
some of all of those? Oh.
Yeah. Well, I haven't brought any more. That's it.
Ah, that's it.
I brought a couple of each of the first three and a couple of the latest, and the rest just one. So if you want, if you want something I haven't got, I couldn't bring everything. I go to, Eugene has Art in the Vineyard has a local authors booth, and County Fair has a local authors space, and then there's the library. Lane Library District book fair in Christmas, and I lug books to all of those, and you never know what people are going to want, and you lug them all home again, and you, of course, you take extra of the first one because there's a lot of people who've not read any and they want to start with the first one. There's never enough of them. I always run out. So I've given up trying to please everyone. I thought I'll show you everything I've got. You can get them online. I put a bookmark here for an organization, a company called the Book Depository. They are based in England, but they ship all over the world without shipping charge, no shipping charge. And they have all, as far as I know, they have all the English editions of Daisy and of the Cornish still available, whereas most of them are out of print in America. So if you don't read Kindle, you can't get the American editions, but they're the same words.
Just different covers.
Well, some of the covers, a lot of the covers are the same. So you can order them and get them shipping free from the Book Depository. So do take one of those bookmarks.
Did
but,
you ever
yeah,
think
sorry.
the Daisy series would be so?
No, I thought, well, one reason I thought of the 12-month thing was that, it gives the publisher an incentive to do 12 of them.
Right. Finish up the year.
But here I am with 23, yeah. It's awfully tempting to write another just to make it 24.
So you think this is the last one?
I think this is the last one. Yeah.
For Daisy.
For Daisy. Well, probably for anything, but I don't know.
How
At the moment, I'm far too busy to look for inspiration. You never know when winter comes.
Well, we need to take you some places around here. Yeah. A place called Horse Rock. That's got, wildflowers would be great locale.
Oh yeah, you want to kill someone then?
Well, there's a steep slope. Somebody can tumble.
Somebody can tumble, yeah.
There's a
I'll-
cave, will that help?
The only time I've picked who I was going to kill with malice of forethought was when I'd had a lot of really nasty dental work.
Want to do a dentist?
Yes.
Am I laughing? Kill a dentist. And I was telling my dentist, my new dentist, the one who hadn't done all that horrible stuff that was trying to correct it, I was telling her about it when I was in the chair, which is really brave if you come to think of it. And she said, "It's not a female dentist called Terry, is it?" So I told her it wasn't, and when it came out, she bought copies for everyone in her office. I dedicated it to her.
You must kill a dentist, make it a man.
I don't think there were too many female dentists back then. But, yeah, it's interesting where the ideas come from. As I said, it's often a place. The Tower of London is such an obvious setting. And then the story sort of evolves to fit the place very much. The Rattle His Bones, which is set at the Natural History Museum, it's all about the curators and the collections and so on. And some little tidbits of paleontology and stuff. It was fun doing that research. And the building is just unbelievable. it's Victorian, was it 1880, I think? Most fabulous place. And the archivist whom I was in touch with, it was when email was just really getting going. And I managed to find him online, and he was absolutely thrilled to be answering questions that weren't about the architecture of the building. Apparently, almost all the questions he got were about that. He gave me plans of the original building. But he could have, had I wanted it, told me the names of the cleaners who came in at night to polish the glass cases of the exhibits. I mean, he had it all at his fingertips. Another interesting one was Murder on the Flying Scotsman, where my mother somehow found a man who had worked on the Flying Scotsman as a steward. But he was also a member of the Historical Model Railway Society. And anything he didn't know, he could look up in the group's books. So he told me, you know, what order the cars were coupled in, and how long they paused at which stations, and the whole lot. Get some really interesting things going on with this.
When you were researching places, did you take copious notes? Were you always?
Yes, and
writing
I'll
stuff
tell you
down?
when I didn't take copious notes, and that was my one book set in America, which is The Case of the Murdered Muckraker, in which Daisy and Alec fly across the country in a biplane. And so I thought I'll drive the route. I happened to be going to Denver anyway, so I thought I'll follow the way they flew. And I had this little tape recorder, you know, the voice activated tape recorders, and I managed to record over half of it, and the rest of it was just about incomprehensible anyway. So that was a dead loss. But at least I had a picture in my mind of what it looked like from the ground, even though I didn't have it from the air. And a reader made her husband, who's a small plane enthusiast, an old plane enthusiast, read it. And he apparently said it was had a lot of verisimilitude, which was very pleasing, because you won't get me up in a small plane.
Especially an old small plane.
1920s small plane, no thanks. It was there, forgotten. But that scenery across there is just spectacular. So these are for sale. We must be getting near the end of our time.
It's 7:30.
7:30, yeah. So if anyone wants to look at them or to...
I'll take a look.
I'd be happy
Yeah,
to sign anything.
Do you take credit cards, or is it cash only?
I'm afraid cash or check.
Okay.
Yeah, I
But I
don't have
do
one of
have
those
cash for
credit
you
card
if you
thingies.
Okay, I don't know which one.
I know where to find you.
Yeah, sure.
I don't take credit cards.
You're getting out
Somewhere.
I don't know. I didn't hear it. Okay, I have pictures.
You're going to send them to me?
I'll send some to you.
Send some to
I
me.
think this is the first one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm on
Is that
Facebook.
okay? I took some pictures, so to put on our Facebook and her Facebook.
Okay.
Or even the messenger. I send them to Linda.
Oh, yeah, she really would like pictures in the messenger.
Okay.
Get over there, Shannon.
Would you like your name?
I'll model. Tell her what's
Sure,
around here.
Pauline,
I was going through some stuff
C-L-A-U-D-I-N-E,
and I found a messenger from
C-L-A-U-D-I-N-E. Do we know the price on this?
Oh, the large scale paperbacks are 12 and the small ones are 5.
Oh, it's good that you did this through that.
Yeah, that's just what I was thinking.
They're all different prices, and I find it easier just to say just 5.
That's the one.
So you want the new?
Oh, yeah, I want to get these
These
two.
two, okay, so that's 22, 24.
So this is the first one.
I forgot what you said. Did you say 24?
Yes.
Okay, I think I got it, so we don't get it.
Well, don't worry about it.
My wallet changed.
Oh, do we want to,
Let them buy in the middle.
Yeah.
Sally, do we want to stop the
Oh, yeah.
live feed?
I don't know how to stop it.
Yeah, that's a
Oh.
really useful.
Yeah.